We have been talking about Kim Davis, as most Americans have been talking about Kim Davis over the last couple of weeks. Of course, Kim Davis is the county clerk down in Kentucky who has stood by her religious convictions and refused to issue or let the rest of her office issue any marriage certificates to same-sex couples. Yesterday, she reported for work and had this to say before she entered her office.
While my case may be the most visible right now, there are millions of other people out there in the private and the public sector who face and are in the same position. And they also need reasonable accommodations.
Reasonable accommodation is what she's asking for, and as an elected official, the question, of course, is what kind of reasonable accommodation does an elected official get granted when her job is to issue marriage license? So this has become a gut-wrenching topic for many people torn between their religious values and our desire for a secular government. Joining us right now, Carmen Fowler LaBerge. She is a religious liberty activist and also a leader with the Presbyterian Lay Committee, that is a conservative offshoot of the Presbyterian Church USA. Thanks for joining us, Ms. Fowler LaBerge.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Well, listen, you've spoken out for years about religious liberty and about individual Americans having the right to practice their religion despite whatever laws happen to come down out of Washington, D.C. or their local municipality. So I would think, on the face of it, that you would be supporting Kim Davis, but you actually believe that she's not the Rosa Parks that many people are painting her to be.
Well, I certainly support her individually as a Christian. I understand her motivation. This intersection of faith and work in our culture, I think, is the growing edge of the religious liberty conversation. What will we or will we not accommodate, both in private spaces in terms of work and then in these public spaces where our public officials are involved? And that's probably the particular point of conversation where I disagree with some of my other conservative colleagues on this subject. I understand why she's doing what she's doing, and yet I would disagree that this is the appropriate, possibly the appropriate place to take this particular stand at this time in our culture.
Why is that? Can I just ask? Because it seems to me that you would want to support a woman who is saying, no, I'm fundamental, and you oppose same-sex marriage, right?
That's correct.
As the law of the land. And so she's with you on that, and she's saying, why force me to violate my Christian beliefs and my religious conscience by having to endorse something that I fundamentally believe my religion says is a sin?
Right, and so at the point in which she refuses to sign a document, I understand. At the point in which she prohibits other people from signing those documents, or at the point in which she prohibits others from being able to issue those licenses to folks who the Supreme Court says at this point in American history are eligible to be married in this country, that's where this conversation between would I as enthusiastically support the religious liberty of a Muslim who was declaring some aspect of Sharia law to morally trump or be naturally superior to what I perceive to be a just law in the United States of America, would I as enthusiastically support that individual's personal religious liberty to stand in the way of one of my rights? And that's I think, where this conversation is ultimately going to come down to. Will Christians as enthusiastically, publicly defend a Muslim in this same position? And that's the religious liberty conversation that we have to have as Americans, because we're talking about freedom of conscience. We're not talking about just specifically the very narrow band of Christian religious conscience or Christian religious liberty or Christian religious freedom. If we're going to talk about religious liberty and religious freedom in the United States of America, then I've got to as enthusiastically be willing to defend the rights of a person whose faith I don't share.
Yeah.
As I would people whose faith I do share.
Well, let me ask you then, if I could get you to sort of put it, some of the more interesting debates we have when it comes to things like this are moments where great legal concepts and great constitutional concepts come in conflict. Because on one hand, you've got this issue of freedom of religion. And then, on the other hand, we have this overriding concept that we should in this country obey the rule of law. So where is the line there for you? At what point do you say, no, she is right?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because certainly standing up against unjust laws is is who we are as Americans in the spirit of the civil rights movement and everything else. So I absolutely wholeheartedly agree with you. That's the conversation we've got to have. And I'm not saying to you that I have the precise language or answer to that question in terms of where we're going to come down as a culture, but that's the conversation. You've absolutely articulated the question that we need to be asking and answering as a people today.
So do you have any sense of at what point it goes the other direction?
When you say at what sense it goes the other direction in terms of
I mean, your position right now is that we need to obey the rule of law and that you have sympathy for a position. At what point in a situation like that does a person's religious liberties and their religious beliefs become more important than the rule of law?
I think it's at the point of your own personal conscience. And so that's why I would say for her as an individual, I absolutely support that this is where she is. She's a prisoner of conscience, and I absolutely respect that as an individual. My question or concern is whether or not this is the case that as a religious liberty activist, we want to pursue and uphold and say, this is the one, this is the seminal case that's going to get us there in terms of elevating the conversation to the one that you just pointed out. And that was where I was saying, I'm not sure that this is the best case to be hanging all of that on. But we don't always get to choose that, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Nobody chose Rosa Parks, right? She's the one that chose to not give up her seat, and she became the person. I'm not sure Kim Davis wants to be that person. That's not what I hear her articulating. I don't hear her, saying I'm prepared for this and I want to pursue this. So if she indeed is the person, and maybe time has elevated her to this position, and therefore we need to be building a substructure around that in terms of articulating the arguments well at this intersection of does the rights of one individual in terms of their freedom of conscience and religious liberty, where does that trump and or intersect with and or rise in superiority in our thinking to the rights of another individual who is seeking to express their freedom of sexuality. Where does this... Yeah,
we only have 30 seconds left. I got to ask you,
Yep.
I mean, Kim Davis has a lot of advisors, including a couple of presidential candidates here, but you advise people on the intersection of faith and public life. If she were to ask you, what should I do? This is my crisis of conscience here. What should I do, Carmen? What would you tell her?
I would advise her to absolutely stand her ground in terms of her own freedom of conscience, but not stand in the way of the rule of law in terms of its application through her deputies.
And here's the problem. Because of the law in Kentucky, any certificate, she has to sign it or it's not valid. So there's no way to have it both ways.
Well, certainly we're a people who are creative enough to find an accommodation if we want to. And ultimately, that's the question. Do we, under our rule of law, want to find an accommodation for every individual? And if we want to find one for Kim Davis, we're going to have to be willing to find one for the DMV individual who is Muslim and does not want to issue driver's licenses to women.
All right. We're going to have to leave it right there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's an interesting discussion.
Carmen Fowler LaBerge is her name, and she was our guest. Thank you so much for joining us.